All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 92 or 93. We'll decide this weekend if I record another one. And I am really pleased to have a very great guest today. Really pumped about this. We've been talking about this for a while and making it happen. So today I have Daniel Romito with Pickering Energy Partners as my guest today. So Daniel, welcome to the PetroNerds podcast.
It's just Dan. Yeah, I appreciate the formality, but yeah, just Dan. That's cool. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for having me. I'm
Yeah, just Dan. We'll
just
keep it to
Dan.
Dan. Um, Okay, so today it's Friday. It's August 25th, 2023. Jerome Powell has spoke. We can talk about that if you want to talk about that. But that was probably the biggest thing that I think in the news today. We have definitely seen pressure on oil prices. I certainly in this podcast, want to talk about the market and the state of oil
Mhm.
prices and where they're at. But there's a number of things we're going to talk about with you, and that's really I think ESG and some
Mhm.
things in that sphere. And listeners know that I love to talk about ESG, probably in a little bit
I
differently way than you do.
yeah, I can envision that we're gonna have some disagreements on some things, but that's okay.
Oh yeah, well, that'll be fun. That's good for it's good for listeners. So we'll timestamp this with and not get into too much of this because I want to focus on the conversation with you. And I think listeners will have a lot will really enjoy it. But WTI right now is 79.96. Brent is 84.61. We've come off some of the lows we saw this week, but we've definitely seen some serious pressure. And I've been telling clients and telling listeners this for a while. I don't see this massive material upside in the second half that a lot of folks have been banking on. Not that it can't happen for numbers of different reasons, but that it's really not a demand led driven. And most of that has been on the back of serious concerns with China, which I got into the last
Mhm.
podcast. We can talk about a little bit of that as well if you have thoughts. Henry Hub is at 255, still seeing pressure there. Dutch TTF, we've lost some gains after this. Potential Woodside stuff in Australia and the labor issues going on there, but it's at
Mhm.
1016. We've lost some gains. Copper, I've been throwing this new one out there because I think people really need to be paying attention to copper. This does get into the
Let
ESG and the
let's
energy
hear it.
transition. Well,
Uh huh.
copper prices are at 379, and I think that if you didn't
Yep.
listen to the latest episode, I think that copper prices are just like oil prices are a future forward-looking indicator for the health of the economy, and they're
Yes.
so intrinsic within the hopes of the energy transition, but they're also intrinsic within just the fabric of most economies, especially the
Right.
Chinese economy and emerging markets. And so when we've seen the big ramp up in copper prices that we saw the first part of post 2020 and the COVID boom and everything. And then we've come off that. So we can get into copper as well, but I think it's in this sluggish territory, and I think it's telling us something. And then holy moly, and as a person, a young person, a homeowner, we should talk about this as well. But 30-year mortgage at 7.39%, which is
That's
just
insane.
it's
Absolutely
absolutely
insane.
insane. 10-year yield. If you guys have seen mortgages or yields this week, folks, they have been
It's
incredible.
depressing.
And I mean, actually, if you have savings, I think there's a nice balance here because we're starting to finally get rates that are not competitive
Oh,
with inflation, but you're getting to the point, at least the sticker price for inflation, they are competing. But it's you can put your money, and fixed assets and fixed income are now finally having rivaling the market, and so you can get 4 to 5% easy guaranteed money back with secure assets. So
yep.
that's what's happening in the market right now. But this problem with the 7.39%, Jerome Powell didn't mention it, but he had a short 15-minute speech in Jackson Hole, Wyoming today, and he sounded pretty hawkish to me.
Yeah.
He was probably a little more dovish, I think, in his overall deliverability, but he was hawkish in his words of actually saying, we have to fight inflation. And the stuff that we heard this week was a lot of folks coming out and warning about inflation picking up in the second half of the year or spikes in it. And I think and also credit worthiness and the massive amount of debt
Mhm.
we have in America being a problem. So I know I've timestamped that and thrown a lot out there. So any of these you want to, you, you're
No, I mean,
so
real quick on
yeah.
the mortgages, like mortgages, that 7.4% is absolutely insane, right? If you think about where mortgage rates were at this time last year, I think they were right around like 3.5, maybe 4. And so for that mortgage rate to essentially double within a year, that is not a great sign. And I think your point on debt is absolutely spot on. I think what people fail to recognize is that credit card debt is variable. And with credit card debt, there was a story about it last week being at an all time high. It's like some ridiculous number in the trillions. what you're going to begin to see is this clamp down on the consumer. And it's a great segue into what's actually going on into energy, because what are we seeing? We're seeing gasoline prices rise. We're seeing commodity prices rise. We're seeing just the overall cost of living rise. And I mean, I have my theories, and I'll have to put my tinfoil hat on, and talk like conspiracy theory, Dan. But I'll save you that. We are in an inflationary environment, and I just don't know why we don't come out and say it. And this whole notion of this soft landing, I think it would be better off just being very honest about the situation. Clearly, we can't do that, particularly going into an election year and with the primaries. But this inflationary dynamic is going to be, it's really going to be nasty next year, right? I am sort of a pessimist. Usually, I'm the optimist, but if you're looking at probability of recession, it's in the low 70s. Like, this is going to happen, and we need to prepare accordingly.
I couldn't agree more in terms of definitely we're having a recession. I think actually half of the country is already more than the half of the U.S. is already in recession. And I do think it's interesting that you just mentioned this, and I think we'll bring this back to energy because I don't think a lot of people
Mhm.
appreciate what are the potential risks on for energy, and we're seeing this. I think whether you're talking to service companies or E&Ps, the weight to
Mhm.
this. I have people that direct message me all the time that tell me what they're seeing in the field, and it's great, and I love spending time in the field. But we can come back to that. But Larry Summers was just on and he was talking on Bloomberg, and he was talking about the Fed, Jerome Powell's remarks, and
Mhm.
he's been really critical of the Fed, early on, saying they weren't raising rates early enough. I was extremely critical from the very get go when we started seeing inflation rising and the Fed was behind the curve. Obviously, the Fed has continued to raise rates, and I think what we heard from Jerome Powell was that we're probably going to have to. There's a likelihood that we're going to keep rates high,
Yeah.
and which is good because it means that they're not going to, if they're at least maintaining these rates, it means that inflation is going to have to come down. And the
Right.
problem is that it's going to have to be on um, the employment side has to give, and nobody wants to admit this. So this recession that people
Right.
are like, it's never going to happen. It's like, yes, when people start losing their jobs, that's when things really start breaking and slowing. That's when the housing starts slowing. That's when people start having to
Yeah.
move. That's when we start having some real shifts. And I actually think that the energy industry is not quite ready yet for. I'm
No.
not sure. I think the oil and gas industry is not ready to. They've gotten pretty comfortable, I think, with these 70s and low 80s oil prices, and
Yeah.
they don't even want to really admit, when they touch in the 70s, or in March we saw 69, and they have all this. They just continue. Most companies, I'm not saying everyone, but has a bullish sentiment, and it's that the long term drivers. And I think that we need to be thinking about the next 2 years and how they look, because
Yeah.
if people are intelligent about this, and this is businesses that anybody that's touching energy and in and outside oil and gas, but especially if you're a service company, you really need to know what's going on in the space so that you
Right.
can navigate it, because the next couple of years could look pretty rocky.
Yeah. I almost view it as like this check mark dynamic. I don't know what the official economic term is for like a check mark looking pattern on a chart, but I think you're spot on. Over the next 2 years, 3 years will be rocky, but then if you're in energy over the long term, like this misguided perception that oil and gas is going away, to me is it borders it's so insane that it's almost hilarious, right? If you're making the long 8 to 10 year play, oil and gas is going to be here in perpetuity. And we're beginning to see that already, where, one of our PMs in Sailing Stone had this amazing um, kind of line in their commentary. They wrote, as spreadsheets move to shovels, the economic realities of the energy transition are actually kicking in, right? So once again, the energy transition looks good, and the concept of moving away from oil and gas looks good in spreadsheets and in Word documents. But then when you actually begin to employ those practices, there's a whole new set of economic realities that take hold, where people are beginning to say, oh, wait, maybe we gone a little bit overboard. And we've definitely seen that, whether it's Germany, we're definitely seeing that. We'll see that in the wintertime as well. Like this winter, I was just talking to somebody, I guess this winter is anticipated to be really, really nasty. So when in the 2 years, yeah, it will be dicey. Over the long term, like the next 7 to 10 years, I mean, I couldn't be any more bullish on the energy sector.
Yeah, and this is great because I think we were arguing when we met
Yes.
at Dan and I met at the Oklahoma Petroleum Alliance meeting that's in Dallas, and he was kind enough to hang out with me because I didn't know anyone there. So we became fast friends, and then he gave a presentation, really, rah-rahing ESG, and I wanted to argue with him about it quite a bit. So I think, and that's why I think this is great because as we were talking before we pressed record, some of the things I want to get into is that
Yep.
these complexities that you're drawing with ESG, with the energy transition, and actually I think with fiscal spending. And that's something I was going to mention is that at least Larry Summers brought it up was that what our Fed is not doing, and to your point on the political side, is not talking about the complications
Yep.
around inflation right now in America. You hear it talked about in the UK. I mean, the Bank of England says, talks about government spending directly and how these are these aims are at odds with what they're trying to do to cool inflation. And the UK has massive
Right.
inflation right now and labor
Hmm.
cost inflation. And so we have incredibly high fiscal spending. The Biden administration
Yep.
has spent like drunken sailors. You have a Democratic Congress that has just went crazy, and we have so much more spending, so much larger entitlement programs than we've had in the past. And we
Yep.
did lead the world in food inflation, in early on, way before the war in
Hmm.
Ukraine, because we had increased entitlement programs and food stamps and things. And these are
Yep.
realities. And then now with high interest rates, our debt costs more. The interest on our debt costs more than our defense spending. And these are serious consequences. And so then you roll in this idea, then you talk about what you're bringing up on the energy transition is that, I actually don't think we've materially moved into it, but I do think that, New York, there was an article from Politico that I'll be talking about more in detail in another podcast, but it's fascinating. Like New York, I did not realize had the commitments they have. They're like California. California has
Yep.
extended the life of a few gas-fired power plants, but New York has stringent requirements to basically be cut their emissions by like 70% in by 2030. So
Yep.
and the people are pushing back on this, and the Democrats are actually getting nervous in New York because they're realizing that these rising energy costs are going to, maybe hurt them
Yeah.
politically. And I think that, there's something where we're seeing that, we heard it. You're not sorry, you're in Florida, not Texas, but we're hearing about it in Texas where, the wind is not blowing because it's so damn hot. And so now they're
Yep.
having issues with peak load issues, and telling people
Hmm.
to use less power. So parts of this we're seeing in reality, but other parts it hasn't even gotten started yet in terms of the reality of really shoving this stuff into the grid.
Yeah, so I mean, if there's any model for how not to do things, it should be New York and California. And
Absolutely.
look,
And
I
Europe.
grew up I and Europe, right? And I grew up in Illinois, right? I'm a transplant to Florida, but I grew up and spent, almost my entire adult life in Illinois. And I know this is going to sound harsh, but you sort of get what you vote for. So they continually put
Yeah.
these people in that just don't understand what the hell they're doing. So I have part of me is empathetic for that, but another part of me where you just keep voting in the same people and the same policies. So that is essentially on you. And in fact, that's probably the root of the Great Migration, which is a conversation for another day. It's like living in Florida, where I live, nobody is from Florida. Where's everybody from? Everybody is from Illinois,
Yep.
Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and California. That is it. And they all moved here for the same reason. It's just the policies in those respective states, energy included, just do not work. And the whole notion of these arbitrary targets, whether it's 2030 or 2050, like I know this is a family program, so I won't say the words that I want to say, but they're completely asinine, right? They're just feel good fluff stories. And in many cases, all you are essentially doing, and I'm sure we're talking about this, is you're moving emissions from the back end to the front end, right?
Yes.
There is no net zero economy. Net
No, there's
zero
not.
economy
There's
is
not.
you turn off the economy. That is net
Right.
zero.
Yep.
And I was having this conversation earlier with someone I would probably say who leans left, reasonable person, smart person, but is under this impression that all oil and gas does is destroy everything. And once again, oil and gas is, they're not angels by any means, but neither is any sector. But in any case, my point to her was, what do you need to get lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, any sort of metals and mining input that is required in the energy transition? You need big
Massive
diesel
backhoes
machinery.
and diesel machinery. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need diesel machinery and you need strip mining. And you do it in places of the world that just don't have the same degree of focus on health and safety or regulations
Or emissions,
that
or
we
even
or
pollution.
emissions that we have. And clearly we'll talk about this more because you triggered me a little bit. You're like, I promote ESG, kind of. There's parts of it I promote, but this whole notion that we need to restrict access to capital, particularly in an environment where hurdle rates and the cost of capital is skyrocketing, that is insane. That is not going to work. And unfortunately, it's going to be the commoner, you and me, right? Well, I don't make, I don't make Trisha money, but the commoner in New York and in California that's going to pay the price. And you're beginning to see that, right? If you see it in Germany, you have rolling blackouts in California. New York's policy is insane. Like their governor, conversation for another day. It just doesn't work. And I hope they come to their senses soon and at least have some sort of semblance of economic reality incorporated within their policy making.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really good points and fantastic comments. I think the one thing we can, if we have time, get into the little. I think the COVID transplant. The reason I think it's interesting is because you are from Chicago, and I know at that
Mm-hmm.
conference, the guy Apocalypse Never, who is going to be on the podcast as well,
Yeah.
you asked him a question about the state of Chicago, and I always think about Chicago in the back of my mind because when people are from there, and I lived in a suburb of Chicago when I was really little, between 4 and 8, and
Okay.
I haven't been there in a long time, but I mean, the stuff I hear now, and I've traveled there several
Yeah.
years ago. Stuff I hear now is absolutely horrible. And Ken
Yeah.
Griffiths, whatever, all these
Yeah.
Citadel.
Citadel.
Yeah, Citadel. They all left. They went to Florida. Started shop at
Yep.
the Four Seasons in Florida during COVID, and everybody like made this amazing COVID bubble for work, but everybody
Yeah.
left. But now what you're starting to hear, and this is like real earnings calls, whether it's Dick's Sporting Goods or it's Target
Yeah.
earnings, which I talk about, or it's Walmart has left Chicago, and they won't say explicitly
Yeah.
why, but they've left Chicago because of
Everyone
crime,
knows
and
why.
the crime is so high and the theft is so high, and people have to really, when we start talking about, like, when we're talking about inflation intrinsic throughout the economy, it's like when you have this pushing labor cost inflation, when you have people on strike, when you have people stealing stuff. Last
Yeah.
night I was out with a friend, and I was at a restaurant, and we were a homeless person walked into this very nice restaurant, and it was fine, but like, I mean, everybody was kind of like, what's going on here, and didn't know if what he was coming in, going out. It was a little confusing, and it was late, and but it was kind of amazing because there were cops, two cop cars at Union Station sitting right there, and I thought,
Yeah.
interesting that they're not sort of monitoring the situation. And it wasn't like anything bad was going to happen, but or it could have, or like, it's just the monitoring the situation. I thought, I was telling these guys that in Colorado, and not directly this homeless person, but I was telling the guys at the bar, I was like, in Colorado, the prosecution is $1,500. I was like, so I can steal $1,500 of stuff from you right now. And
Hmm.
technically, you can't, like, you're probably not going to prosecute me
Right.
because under $1,500. And that's where this theft is coming from. So it's like, and I think about Target and all these places, and these cities are really, it's something, it's kind of like the fiscal side that Jerome Powell doesn't want to talk about, how complicated it is. It's like
Yeah.
most people don't want to talk about, these, when we have crime in these cities and we have this rising theft, the cost of these economies is really huge, and the cost of businesses is really huge. You
Yeah.
see it in DC, this whole work from home doesn't, the fact that people aren't in offices. I mean, the implications of all this have lots of
As me
knock-on
and you are
effects.
working from home.
Well, I've always worked from home, and certain people
Yeah.
can, but I
Well,
think a
I mean,
lot of
I
people
think,
can't.
you bring up a good point. So there's a couple
It's
things
not
on that. I
it's not
think
the working from
uh,
home, by the way. It's the people traveling when they say they're working from home. That's causing
that's
inflation, and that's causing labor
that's true
productivity to
too.
go down. So
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
that's true too. I did have a laugh when you gave your presentation. You're like those worker from homers. I was like, hey, that's
Yeah.
me. Anyway, but I know what you're saying, and you are right. But no, I think what's irritating is it seems like we're in a time, and I don't know when it happened, but it seems like it happened around COVID, maybe a little bit earlier, where the label, the definition of the label became much more important than like the underlying policy. So in other words, what it was called or how it was perceived high level almost trumps of what the no pun intended of what the impending ripple effect is. And once again, back to kind of the theme of your podcast, like this notion of energy transition. The term energy transition is very misleading, right? Transition would imply that you're moving from A to B and you're going to do it in like some sort of predefined timetable. And that's not what the energy transition is. The energy transition, at least the way that we think about it at our firm and how I think about it personally, is we are expanding optionality within the marketplace, right? You have this macro dynamic where the global consumer, regardless of what their familiarity with the energy space is high level wants this decarbonization movement to be employed. And so clearly the investment community has reacted, but I think they've gone way too overboard, i.e. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Their policies are not realistic. They touch, or borderline insanity, if we're being honest. But the notion that we are transitioning from anything is incorrect. We are expanding optionality in the market because empirically, and we can get into the math, oil and gas, at least for our lifetime and probably our kids' lifetime, is going to be an economic tenet of the global economy. It has to be. If you look at population growth, developing countries are growing faster than developed nations, and part of their path to prosperity is they need reliable energy. And I know that becomes a little bit of a cliche, and I can't believe that becomes controversial. We talk to some people who are anti-oil and gas or more of the detractor crowd, where that's not a valid. They claim that it's not a valid argument, and then they
Right.
don't really
Well, they
back it
think those
up.
countries are gonna the developing countries they're pushing them to leapfrog, and we can get into that whole thing because that's another thing. Sorry, keep going.
But yeah, I mean, the point being is, we've as a society or as a global economy, we've landed on this term energy transition, and it was almost doomed from the beginning, right? The label transition is
100%.
is factually incorrect. It is expansion of optionality, right? We are in this technological inflection point to where we have better technology, not necessarily functional or scalable yet, where we can incorporate wind, or we can incorporate solar, or we can incorporate hydro, but we can't fully rely on it. Like, the math just doesn't allow us to. And what we've done is we've allowed commoners, and I mean that respectful, like people outside of the industry, um, to think that, number one, oil and gas is inherently evil and is destroying everything. There is a semblance of truth to that with various events that have taken place, but that doesn't mean you burn down the house, right? You improve and you hold people accountable. But people, I always think it's hilarious, and I gave this story at the conference, and I'm sure you've had this before. If you ask someone what powers EVs, they're going to say batteries, and then you say, well, what powers batteries? They say electricity, and if you say, well, what powers electricity? They're like, what? Like electricity?
Yeah.
And it's like, and
Yeah.
to us, it's so mind numbing. But that is one of the foundational detriments to the energy transition perception. And I know we'll talk about this on the ESG front. You have just different people defining ESG differently, and it's sort of what's going on with the energy transition.
It's a massive
Is definitely
hodgepodge.
exactly, it's like an eye of the beholder thing. It's like, I think ESG is this, so therefore we have to do this, and it's because there's not one unified um, common definition of what it is. It's becoming a total mess.
Well, I mean, so you've said a lot there, which I think
Yep.
is great to hear, especially from your perspective. And we'll get into this a little bit deeper. I think there's a couple tracks I want to take this on the ESG and the energy transition.
Sure.
You clearly need to listen to the previous podcast I did because I basically I've coined a phrase I'm going to keep using now, which is throwing good money after bad energy. And I think
Yeah.
that we have to, when we talk about one something I want to discuss with you is that a lot of people struggle with what the energy transition is, where it's at in terms of the investment cycle and ESG. And
Hmm.
when I talk to whether I'm talking to public companies and CEOs or service companies or businesses or governments, everybody has a different vantage point. And I mean, I was on a frac tour and I had a bunch of different people from DC in May, and they were like, "Oh, I think the ESG thing, we don't need to work on ESG anymore in terms of the pushback." And I was like, "We 100% do because."
Yeah.
Most companies, every company has a different view of what ESG is, and I get
Yeah.
very frustrated from the reality of one, is this even good energy? Because it's a lot of this is not, hydro. On the hydro side, the technology is so far. I mean, hydro is one thing. Sorry, it's the hydrogen is a whole different
Yeah.
thing. Hydro's power. Hydrogen is so far out there. We're talking, 50 years. And when people say this, when companies tell me like hydrogen, I'm like, really? You're a publicly traded company. I need a return if I'm investing in you
Yeah.
sooner than 50 years from now. But you're investing in stuff that maybe have a 50 or 100-year return. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, but you can't tell me what those returns are going to be. And that there is a reality that in the energy transition, in terms of the big bulk themes, electric vehicles, solar, and wind, most of them do come almost exclusively come from China. And there, this forced labor component, which I'm keep bringing up, and I don't think people really appreciate what it means when you have free labor. It means that you
Yeah.
drop those costs really low. And something that we're seeing in Europe is the way they flood the market with these solar panels. They can do that, and they have very, very cheap costs. You can have that
Hmm.
with cheap and free to forced labor. So not only do you
Right.
have all these components, but you have pretty bad forms of energy. But by the time that solar panel is taking the energy all the way to this light bulb above me, we've lost a lot of energy. And there's a lot of cost to that, not just from the cost from that crappy solar panel made with forced labor in the province of Xinjiang, um, made with coal, made with subsidized
Yeah.
power, made with subsidized everything, made from the Communist Party. All these are bad things. But then, as the country of America, we've had taxpayer dollars are paying for this.
Yeah.
We're paying for longer, transmission lines, and putting a lot of money into this just to use this so to pretend to feel good when it's not dropping emissions, and it's really
Yeah.
hurting the economies and society. So there's so much complexity to throwing out this is the energy transition. And I think, I mean, you have the perspective from an investment side. I know that we argued about this, that in your presentation you were talking about these, to me you were promoting getting companies to sign on to ESG stuff, and getting their metrics and clarity. And the reason
Yeah.
I want to talk about that, and I push back on that, is because I think that if we don't have people like me that are out there talking about the realities of this and pushing back on that, what you have is the stock market and investors and everyone that's leaned
Hmm.
so far into the energy transition. And you got this massive hodgepodge, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock. They say ESG, but all they care about is the E, and they're not even doing anything on the E. They're complicit in human rights violations in China, and it's
Hmm.
it's a joke. So when you don't have people talking about this and pushing back, we just allow it to run its course, and then it gets embedded and entrenched in the economy. And then the cost of capital and the ability for oil and gas companies and real energy to access funding, we're already seeing the limitations
Yeah.
to that. And I think it's hugely problematic, and that's inflationary. So sorry, that was a long rant. That you can
No,
take
so
that.
you might find this very surprising. You talk way faster than I can write, so you spit off a lot there. So let me take this one
Yeah,
at a time.
take whatever you want.
Yeah, just pick. It's like the Cheesecake Factory menu. Okay, so on the metric side, let me break out the argument as to why I feel companies should publicly disclose the material ESG related metrics,
Okay.
um, in their either registration documents, actually not in their registration documents, but in some sort of report. So the overarching thesis that I personally have along with our firm is that oil and gas demand, or the need for oil and gas, is not going anywhere. The global energy mix, as we know, is 85% oil, gas, coal. In order for any developing country to pave a road towards prosperity, they need access to fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. That is an undeniable fact that I don't care who you are, I will debate till I'm blue in the face.
Not
So
even
we
prosperity,
can
just to live.
just to live, right? But the path towards prosperity, right? There's a direct correlation between standard of living increases and access to affordable, reliable
Yes.
energy coming in the form of hydrocarbons. So on that fundamental premise, we can agree. Now, if you look at the providers of fossil fuels, you essentially have five countries. You have the United States, Canada, the UK, you have Iran, and let's just call it Russia, right? There's other providers in there, but in terms of like
Saudi
top
Arabia.
five, those
Yep. Yep.
those are the top five, correct? Let's say top six, and we'll throw
Yeah.
the Saudis in there. So the thesis is, if the world is going to need um, hydrocarbons, like that is an unequivocal fact. And the second component, or the complementary component, is, well, we're now in a global macro where the world is demanding decarbonization. Like, we can agree on that. Like, everybody wants to decarbonize. Even I, to a certain extent, think decarbonization is cool. I think there's a limit, right? We don't go all the way, but we try to get like some cool technology in play. Um, so if the world needs fossil fuels and hydrocarbons, and if the world wants to decarbonize, well, let's analyze empirically who does that the best. So what we've looked at, along with other people, it's not like we have this novel analysis. We have our own spin on the analysis, but it's by no means original. We look at efficiency, right? So if you look at the GDP growth of the United States since 2000, you have on average a 2.7% annual growth rate of GDP, but you simultaneously done that using 40% less emissions. So emissions per capita over the last, call it 23, 24 years has decreased 40%.
Yep.
So in other words, the United States has figured out how to decouple.
With natural
Therefore,
gas.
United States producers are the most efficient. We're the only country on the planet with that sort of disparity, that sort of divergence between GDP growth and emissions per capita.
By shoving natural
So
gas into the grid.
exactly, like, and once again, that's a function of technological innovation, creating functional. I would argue that natural gas is probably a quote unquote green technology because it's replacing some form of coal, right? There's a substitution factor there. But if other countries are seeking hydrocarbons and fossil fuels, why would they go to Saudi Arabia or Iran or Russia, right? If they are serious about decarbonization, why wouldn't they go to the country that displays that divergence between production and emissions? And oh, by the way, there is no country on the planet that has the health and safety standards that we have, right? People always laugh when we're working with clients, and I'll say, look, it's table stakes, but you need a human rights policy, you need a anti-child slavery policy. Like, what are you talking about? That's why would we ever do that? It's completely against the law. I'm like, we take for granted in the United States that we just don't do that. You pointed out in China that the reason labor is so cheap is because it's usually forced labor.
And
So,
increasingly in the sector. But why? I guess my question here is that to you is that, and I think Chris Wright has done a really good job bringing this stuff up about the question of it's not what if it's not about carbon? And the reason I say,
yeah,
we were talking about the fiscal complexities and Jerome Powell and everything. Look,
sure,
this has become increasingly political, and we have to, as
yeah,
folks who analyze the space, understand how much money and government spending and crap you throw under this, and how many people have gotten very rich on very crappy
yeah,
forms of energy, low BTU content energy. Lots of money is being thrown at this. Now, entities that trade and move stuff, they make money no matter what. So,
yep.
BlackRock, State Street, anybody who's doing this stuff, they're making money on the moves, and people will make money on that. Now, we'll get into. I would like to ask,
So
where state.
just real quick
Yeah,
too,
go
because
ahead.
you bring up some good points, but um, from that standpoint, I disagree with Chris Wright slightly. Um, when you say it has become political, first of all, I completely agree with you, but that would also imply that there's an emotional component to this argument, which means it is very hard to sway somebody's emotions. In other words, facts don't sway emotions. What this is becoming, because it's been politicized, is a battle of the spectrums, of opposite ends of the spectrum. So the barbell effect, right? The extreme over here and the extreme over there, and they're just butting heads. What I feel the energy space should be doing is battling for the minds of the pragmatic middle. People are like, hey, I don't know what flowback means, and I sure as hell don't understand the intricacies of energy. I don't even know when I flip on the light switch why the light goes on. And the
I,
way that you appeal to those people is showcasing them empirically and objectively that this company XYZ, whatever it may be, they have decreasing methane intensity, they have decreasing scope 1, they have a health and safety track record that is impeccable. They would otherwise not know that because the narrative has been hijacked and is dominated by individuals who just want to see fossil fuel divestment. You cannot convince them otherwise. And so when you talk about this political thing, I agree with you and it's irritating. But the fact that we combat these things emotionally, like that has gotten the energy space nowhere. Like that has gotten us absolutely no ground.
Yes, but and I don't disagree that that has maybe gone nowhere, but it when we say like this isn't about carbon, and that's why I say we have to be
Mhm.
very careful with that. Of like, look, Colorado is 0.3% of global emissions, so we can
Yeah.
stop living and breathing as humans and wipe Colorado off the planet, and
Hmm.
we wouldn't be a drop in the global CO2 emissions bucket. So we've got to have a reality check in terms of what the hell are we doing, murdering economies and people and hurting people's lives, and
Hmm.
when you talk about the people in the middle, most people are most pragmatic about money. And the reality of the
Yeah.
situation we have is that this stuff is really expensive and it costs a
Mhm.
the policies are really expensive. The implementation that they're shoving through and forcing renewable energy into grids that it doesn't give you
Yeah.
baseload power and is not reliable. Not even before people say, well, it's just not ready. It's a nascent technology. It's not even that. It's pretty bad
Yeah.
forms of energy you're forcing into grids. I think it's interesting you mentioned the methane and the scope 1. You're talking about the battle of the middle and the person that you just said about electricity and where it comes from. It's like they don't know what methane and scope 1 is. I'm sorry, I don't think a
Well, yeah,
lot,
I mean, you're sort
like,
of beating me. You're beating me to the punch. Like I think so. Once again, when Chris, for example, I'm not picking on Chris. Obviously, he's incredibly accomplished, and I have a lot of respect for the guy. But just because he's sort of on the front lines, so to speak, what I think he falls short of doing is he goes from A to D. Right? There's this massive educational curve that exists in the marketplace that just takes for granted what their access to energy actually looks like, and I think there has to be a better concerted effort on behalf of the energy sector in its entirety. And once again, to a certain extent, I realize that's a little bit naive and aspirational. But if I go to someone and say, okay, if I go to any person on the street and I say, tell me about Apple, like they're gonna flash
mhm.
their iPhone, right? If I go to anybody off the street and I say, tell me about Exxon, I would probably bet my house that they would give some sort of like snarky comment of like, ugh, right? But and once again, Exxon's no angel, and there's a string of them that are similar. But I promise you that people wouldn't realize that what was it, 40% of VC funding for green technologies last year came from big oil, right? They are trying to
Right.
diversify
Right.
their book, and I think as a society we've grown impatient. But back to your point on capital discipline, the great irony of this whole thing is the ESG movement, like the conventional ESG divestment crowd. I'm sort of lumping them in one general category, has created an environment where, as we all know, access to capital is contracting. And so, in order to maintain access to capital, most energy companies say we have to go back to basics and institute a distinct level of capital discipline so we earn a return, so we don't lose out on the investors that actually like us, right? We don't want to piss them off. Forget about expanding pools of capital. We can talk about that. And that inevitably delays the quote energy transition. So this whole notion that you divest or you constrict access to capital, that's just delaying the ability for companies to invest in pretty cool R&D or allocate capex to retrofitting assets that were otherwise, let's just call it dirty or underperforming. So I don't think the energy space appreciates that. Number one, regardless of what we think, they're 5% of the S&P. The other 95% of the S&P 500 has been speaking this vernacular and this particular vocabulary for over a decade. So when the 5% says we're not doing this, and we're not doing this because of economic reasons or the fact necessity or economic tenant, I'm sorry, that looks weird to the 95%. Like, we should be, as corny as it sounds, at least attempting to bridge the gap between what that other world likes and says and views and how we go about our business. That's
So,
my
I
rant
mean,
for the day.
no, those that's a good rant, and I mean, we there's pieces of that I think we agree and disagree with. I think that
Mhm.
you bring something up great in all of that, and I love that you brought this back to access to capital because that's where I wanted to go. I want to
Yep.
clarify before we close this podcast. And we're already almost 40 minutes, but I want to
I know
really
it's
clarify
flying.
where ESG is now. Where's the state
Yeah.
of, like, so where is it in terms of, the actual, the money? And because you hear a lot of
Yeah.
like, oh, money's pulling out. People are pulling out of the ESG space.
Money is not pulling. So
No, no, hold,
perspective, like, go
like,
on, continue.
in terms of the fanfare, in terms of like funds and
Yeah.
stuff throwing at this. And look, when I hear ESG money going, or like this is ESG, it's like Tesla. Okay, when it's like big EV companies or big, Chinese EV companies, which to me that's just appalling that that's ESG.
Tesla's
But
not an ESG company.
right, but
But
that's
go
where
on.
money, that's where funds go. So, and then in terms of, you do hear, I know large hedge fund managers that have pulled out and say like these are not
Yeah.
money making plays. So there's a
Mhm.
question there. I do want to talk about the access to capital because we know
Yeah.
that the pressure on the space and the way that people talk about the energy transition and ESG, whether that's any talking heads on TV when you're watching the stock market, it is anti, and I don't call them fossil fuels, it is anti crude oil, natural gas, and coal. And so it influences the retail investor and the generalist investor. And I
Sure.
think the role for education is huge. And I always say this of
Yeah.
like, and lots of folks, me and CEOs and people in the business, we do argue at the how do you educate people and what's the role of it? And
Yeah.
I always come back to there's a role to educate the investors, there's a role to educate your
Yeah.
shareholders, there's a role to educate people, there's a role to educate and when I know this because almost every single Uber driver I have talks to me and they ask me about energy and they become a PetroNerds podcast listener and they genuinely care and they
Yeah.
don't necessarily agree with me but they care, they want to know about what fracking is, how it works, and if it's bad, is it
Yeah.
not bad. And when I have the balls to push back and say, hey, I disagree with this, or I hear something that they're
Yeah.
playing. I'm like, that's completely incorrect. And they're like, what? And then they ask, like, oh, you know about this? And we talk about it. But I think the education piece, for public companies, and I've been on this for a while, but I think it is really serious. It's something I mentioned in that presentation in Dallas was that, look, you do have CEOs where their pay is being tied to ESG metrics. And I think that's important
Sure.
to understand because, again, ESG is not super clarified. And when we're investing, it's not like we have perfect standardized metrics. I don't necessarily think I don't
Hmm.
want them, but then we have companies that are torn. They have to actually produce oil and gas. That's how they make money. Oil and gas companies,
Yep.
by and large, that's how they're making their money. And $80 oil, I think you should be producing oil and gas, but they're pushed.
Yes.
There's lots of complexities there, and ESG is a component of that. And then your investor, your retail investor, and that generalist investor is confused in terms of the
Yep.
narrative the oil companies are saying, which is talking about the energy transition so much that they be investing in. I mean, basically, the oil companies are helping tell the story that oil's not going to be around in 10 years. And so why would you have this
Yeah.
in a long so we've gotten to this 10-year psyche and we have oil companies
Yeah.
talking about their 10-year, I'm not going to list the names, but there's plenty of oil companies out there that are public that have been saying for
We could
15
guess.
years about their 10 years of inventory. So every year they have
Yeah.
another inventory. So I just think like that in terms of the education and the investor space, and we know from the private side and private equity that even they are being impacted by their access to capital because the hesitancy to invest in oil and gas is very strong. Makes me think that there's super big opportunities for other funding to come into the space, different underwriting, which I would hands up, I'm interested in that. And then so those are my three talk about the
Yeah.
education
Yeah.
piece, what you think, and I want to discuss the access to capital and where is, maybe we'll start here, just where is the state of ESG in terms of you're helping companies put these metrics out, but like where are people? I think it's not very clear right now, and partly
Yeah.
that's because where the stock market is and what's happening in the economy, and interest rates going up, people are focused on that, but or if just because we're
So
not
there's a
talking about
couple
it every
different
day,
things.
what is
Yeah.
it?
I mean, look, I know we're 40 minutes in. This would take another 80 minutes. So I'll break it down high level and once again push back or let me know if I'm on track here. Um, at the end of the day, return matters. You have to have ROI, you have to have financial performance in place. But particularly with energy and to a certain extent, but to a lesser extent with other sectors, portfolio eligibility really has been a two-part process, wherein before it was a one-part process. The one part in the day was I've done the underlying work, I've spoken with management, I've gone to site visits, I've crunched the numbers, I've done everything associated with very thoughtful, thorough analysis, and I'm ready to invest. Now, unfortunately, whatever we think, there's this dynamic where you go through that first part, but the second part is essentially a check the box, where if I am not providing that investor with a set of non fundamental data points, whether I deem them material or not, I don't put them in a position to check the box, which does impact eligibility. Now, of course, there's exceptions here and there, but generally speaking, there's this added layer of eligibility that is predominantly, let's call it what it is, a checkboxing exercise, but it has to relate to ESG data. The other component is you have in the publicly traded markets, rating agencies like MSCI and Sustainalytics and ISS pump incredibly poor data into the marketplace. MSCI's data is so poor, it is egregious. And I will love to debate them. They will never do it because they know their methodology is flawed. We've gone through it. But they have maintained distinct influence over index and ETF eligibility. And then whatever we think about ESG in its entirety, you have to be a realist and say, or at least acknowledge, the regulatory environment has now implemented this within its bloodstream. This is part of their DNA. And the analogy that I made during the conference is, if you want me to see me lose my mind, like, what will we bring up? Taxes, right? I think taxes suck. I think it's stupid. I think the way that they determine is absolutely insane. I think it's just, frankly, robbery, and I could go on for days. But you know what I do every April 15th? I shut up and pay my taxes, right? And of course I complain, and I'll have a couple adult beverages, but I still pay them. It's very analogous to the ESG world. Is most of this stuff is ridiculous. Like, we have this tagline that only 25% matters, but we want to focus on 100% of our time on that 25%. It doesn't matter what we think for the time being, right? To separate, I don't want to do this. That's no longer an option, because the Federal Reserve is implementing it. The U.S. Department of Treasury is implementing it.
Okay,
The
so this
National
is where
Association of Insurance Commissioners is implementing it. It is a
this
regulatory fight.
and you brought this up, and the only reason I want to interrupt and ask
Yeah.
this is because
Yeah.
this is critical, and it's everybody talks about this piece, but then they don't go further. So that's where my pushback is of why
Okay.
why can't we do more? And I think everyone needs to be doing more in
Yeah.
terms of educating and pushing back on that, because we've allowed this to be shoved down, top down, from London and New York and European
Mhm.
policies to be pushed on America, where it doesn't work, and you're shoving this stuff through. That, yes, I understand that you're the compliance mechanisms and the need to check
Mhm.
boxes, one for just ticking the boxes for if you're private, to or if you're public on the rating side and getting into certain things. But I think there's a massive need to educate, those portfolio managers in terms of the long onlys. I think there's a massive need for publicly traded companies to be more
Yeah.
vocal about talking about their business and why it's positive. And then we need to figure out, how do we technically push back on all those things that are being shoved through,
Yeah.
very inappropriately, in terms of from a business system and a financial system. How do we educate and push back on that? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, so so I agree with you. I think where we disagree is like the methodology or the strategy on that. I'm under the mindset that beat them at their own game, right? That crowd, like, whatever you want to label them, has won the battle in terms of what is that accepted questionnaire. Like, there is no turning back. Energy, I'm lumping myself in that. We lost that battle. Like, it is pointless to fight. It is a waste of effort. The reason why I push promoting non-fundamental data points that are material, like, that's the caveat, material to valuation premium, is you are taking their language, their infrastructure, their perspective, and you're shoving it back and saying, look how this is trending, right? Look how this is trending relative to the globe. And the part that gets held up is, there is this misnomer in the market that you just don't need oil and gas. So frankly, that's where the educational part comes into
Right.
play. But once you can get that across that respective finish line, then the argument is like, well, who does this the best? Well, even if you do it the best, what is the best form of education? What is the language? What is the vocabulary that everyone universally agrees? It's data and it's trend, right? It is data and trend. The other problem, and you'll laugh, and I'm probably going to get hate mail from engineers. When I talk to an engineer about, like, all right, man, give me the spiel. Like, what do you do? I get a dissertation of a bunch of engineering jargon that I have no idea what the hell they're talking about. Almost dropped one there. We see this in the methane world. It's like, you have the methane tax from the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't reduce inflation at all. Different
Nope.
conversation. Had to get that in there. But when you talk to these companies, for example, of like, you know, what do you do? How much does it cost? And what am I going to get out of this? There isn't one that I've spoken to yet. Now they're getting better, that can just give me the 5 bullet points. I get a 20-minute
Yep.
dissertation on the engineering and the science and the technology. And it's like, bro, I don't understand a thing you're saying. How in God's name is anyone in the generalist community going to understand that? And once again, we push and we promote energy related considerations, but we do it in a vocabulary that just doesn't resonate with the general mass. But what does resonate, in my opinion, is you can showcase the metrics that are required, assuming they're material to your business, required from the outside world, and showcase how they're trending. Like if they're trending in the right way and they're showing the right trend, or excuse me, and they're showing a positive trend, what are you going to argue with?
So,
Right?
but
What are you going to argue with?
is that working? And this is where we'll bring this on the access capital. So clearly, I'll have you back on the
Yeah.
podcast, and we will, we'll just talk about many other things because this is your
Yeah.
fun co-host. But so is that working? I guess my question, and I have a lot of pushback because I think that not to what you're saying directly, but I think in
Yeah.
terms of how we as especially just from a business standpoint and understanding money
Yeah.
and metrics and everything, we're on the education space, but like is these
Yeah.
companies that you've helped when they're hitting the
Yeah.
metrics, is that materially impacting their, so they hit the metrics and then you showcase all this stuff? To me,
Yeah.
they're probably in the near term there's some help. I don't know if they're better access to capital, funding, etc. I
Yeah.
don't know what that looks like, so that's the question for you. But in the long term, I think in the medium term, I think if you give a mouse a cookie, they're going to want a glass of milk. And I think we do have to be
Yep.
careful about how far we push this. And this
Well,
is a
we're saying
regulatory
we're
environment.
saying two different things. We're saying two different things, right? You are talking from a policy, right? I think you're right. Like this administration, and I have countless examples, has incorporated so much bureaucratic bullshit, red tape into the mix. There's 3 climate focused committees just in the Federal Reserve. 3 climate
Yep.
focused committees. You
I've
have,
been
I
I've
wrote them
been talking
down.
about this for years. Yeah.
You have the Federal Supervision or the Supervision Climate Committee, the Financial Stability Climate Committee. You have the Federal Stability Oversight Committee on Climate. And these are massive committees and they have to justify what they do. And what do? They justify their existence by just layering on
Yep.
added disclosure and policy. So we agree to an extent, but I think where you're entering is bad policy set by politicians who just don't know what the hell they're doing in the first place. They're lifelong bureaucrats, and we could talk about term limits and age limits
No,
and
but I'm also saying that those people like Janet Yellen and the SEC proposal for
yeah,
climate change that mentions scope 3 emissions 300 and
yeah,
sometimes. These are
it's
serious things
insane.
that if we don't, if people like it, folks in your space are, if we're not actively talking to folks about this, of saying these can't be implemented because they would
Yeah,
devastate the US economy and make us uncompetitive on so many levels. I'm just saying, so how are you with the stuff that you're doing and that stuff, and because you're trying
yeah.
to hit it, but you've got to push pull here, how do you guys address that? How are you, and maybe that's more, I don't know if you guys directly as a company, but are you addressing
We
that, and
definitely
is
do.
there a way to?
Yeah, we wrote. I mean, I personally wrote as a representative of Pickering Energy Partners a 15-page rebuttal letter against the SEC climate disclosure mandate. I think every part of that respective proposal is insane. I think, once again, a bunch of bureaucrats who had no idea what the hell they were talking about huddled in a room and wrote down stuff that made them feel good. There was no underlying analysis on that. And I've had this debate with people who are very pro SEC, even clients who are very pro scope 3 disclosure. I'm like, the day that someone showcases to me the mathematical correlation between scope 3 disclosure and valuation premium, I will be convinced. I will shut my mouth. I will say, you win, you're right, I'm wrong, you're smart, I'm stupid. And that will be that. The math on climate related metrics correlated to financial performance is shaky at best. Now, once again,
Horribly shaky.
without it's, and once again, I'm a dropout, granted, but I was working on my master's in mathematics from the University of Chicago because I was just going down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out how do you quantify qualitative data. Like, once again, conversation over drinks for another day, way too boring. But every analysis I've seen where ESG related disclosure impacts valuation, totally false, no backing, shaky at best. Now, the analysis on ESG related disclosure broadening access to capital and portfolio eligibility, that is a real thing. So the analogy that I like to make is, ESG disclosure for material non-fundamental data points essentially gets you an invitation to the party. Like, now it's up to you to go to the party and find the significant other to get the dance. Like, that's on you. And that comes in the form of financial performance and sound strategy and management pedigree and all that. But there is no, I say this cliche, there is no magical pool of capital at the end of the ESG rainbow. It is an eligibility thing.
Yep.
And that eligibility either comes in the form of investor requirements because they're on the hook to provide certain data points to their respective investors, or it's from the regulatory perspective, which, to your point, we've allowed policymakers, very bad policymakers, to hijack um, certain energy related considerations and just make terrible decisions. The SEC climate disclosure mandate is insane. The sustainable finance disclosure regulation out of
Yeah.
Europe, parts of it are great, but it's mostly insane. State Bill 253 out of California, or State Bill 261 out of California, which is requiring Scope 3 transparency for, I think it's for over $1 billion in revenue. Like, once again, no one's going to do business in California. So I'm not being sensitive. Maybe I'm being a little bit sensitive, but I think where we disagree is I feel that we can beat them at their own game, and I feel there is something to be said for just showing the prowess of the U.S. energy space quantitatively, because the dirty little secret is we already know we do it the best. And when I say the best, I'm speaking empirically.
Yes, but and I'm so hesitant with that because I spend so much, like when you're spending time with it's all convoluted, right? The policies and the
Sure.
implementation and these metrics and things that people have to hit. And it is impacting. I do want to bring this home on, and we probably have to
Yeah.
move or do another podcast on access to capital, but it is impacting. It's materially impacting access to capital. And the
Yeah.
reason I struggle with this of like, okay, well, we've hit all this metrics and we've proven we're the best. We know this. We do have rule of law. We have the strongest air emission standards the entire world in the US. We always have. Way before
Yeah.
the green
Yeah.
craziness and everything, we had that. And so if you want to, produce a molecule of oil and gas in the cleanest rule of law form without forced labor and everything, you would do it in democratic countries like America. But the movement is
Sure.
against that. And so the push is
Yeah.
against that. And this administration, those on the financial side, lots of folks don't want that. So they're okay divesting at oil and gas. The problem is within publicly traded oil and gas companies, they make their money by drilling for oil and gas. They put
Yep.
billions of dollars. Exxon has put billions of dollars into the energy transition, renewable type stuff, right? And they keep
Mhm.
increasing that, probably for stability to play at the table and all these metrics that you're thinking. However, the return on that is we start having fiduciary responsibilities, I think, here in terms of how we're telling
Oh, of
people the
course.
street about what are these returns going to be. And then you have a problem where oil prices have been relatively high for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
If oil prices were $50 a barrel, I believe the ESG rah is going to decline because the returns are. You can't be saying
See,
I'm gonna invest in crappy forms of energy and not give you a return for 10 years.
I think
They've
I
been
disagree
bailed
with
out.
you there
They've been
real
bailed
quick.
out by higher
Just,
oil
just,
prices. Yeah, go ahead.
just real quick. I would push back on that because our friends at BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard own
Oh, that you called them
35,
friends.
36% of the S&P, right? I know your frenemies at the big three. And once again, index investors, I actually think we're talking about a broader structural problem in the markets. Like, we have swung the pendulum
Yeah, I
way too far in favor of passive funds, index funds. There is no underlying scrutiny of the fundamentals or the strategy or the pedigree or the
agree.
forward-looking
Agreed.
direction of
Agreed.
index funds. It's a bunch of bureaucratic, let's just call it what it is. It is a bunch of individuals at those respective investors, in my opinion, more geared on engineering social policy via corporate strategy.
Yep.
And because they have such immense concentration of power, what they say in most cases goes. Like, you're seeing this in the financial space. Like, this is another conversation that we didn't even touch upon. But when you're seeing companies like Chubb institute a methane mitigation policy within their insurance underwriting, that is in large part a function of the activism, the shareholder activism that
Yes.
they're experiencing with their shareholders, which is driven by a group called As You Sow, which bought like
Yep.
$1,000 worth of shares,
Right. And
right? But
this the same for like the all the green stuff we saw, all the activist investor
yeah,
stuff we saw with the big with Exxon, Chevron, and Shell,
yeah,
and Engine Number One. But let's take this back. So the access to capital, and this is where
yep,
we are seeing a material impact. This has come down the pipeline through all these things in
mhm,
less funds, which is what all these activists and
Mhm.
all these folks intended, less
Yep.
funds available, less people, less generalist investor, less retail investor in the oil and gas space, and
Yep.
less access to capital, whether you're public or private, to actually drill for oil and gas. And that has a
Mhm.
material consequences. It helps your, if you're an oil company, that's why you're selling your long story of like, hey, we're bullish on oil and gas long term, because you
Mhm.
feel comfortable in the prices. But less funding is really problematic. And I get folks on the
Yeah.
podcast that ask this a lot of, hey, long as the policies are really bad, actually it's good for oil prices. And truthfully it is. But like, you want to be in an
Yeah.
environment where you can drill and invest and have a clear regulations and rule of all these things. And so I think the access to capital piece is something that really makes me anxious now, especially when you
Yeah.
hear, like, we heard Chris Atherton with EnergyNet, and we heard NGP at that conference as well, talking about how they would love to be seeing more money go to it, but NGP has their fund is dwindled down in terms of the money
Well,
they
I
raised
also
into it.
think, I mean, so look, I agree with all that, but
Like, isn't that a problem?
it's a total problem. And I'll give you an example. Like, I teach at a university, and I know many universities where their respective endowment has divested. They've
Yes.
instituted a divestment policy. And when you talk to the CIOs, or if you talk to the board, or you talk to the chancellor, they will say something along the lines of, well, our students really pressured us to do this.
Yeah,
And
you hear that
my
everywhere.
response, once again, you're a family program, so I can't say the choice words that I would say, but it is something along the lines of, you're out of your damn mind. And when you talk about just having some sort of, for just some guts, and once again, family program, I get it.
Yeah, sorry, I used
Who
the other word,
cares what
but yes.
who
Yeah.
who cares what the students say? Like, what's hilarious is, you know the students that are utilizing the red flippy cups on Friday and Saturday night,
Yes.
petroleum based, are the
Yes.
same ones that are like, divest from oil and gas. Well, guess what, Junior? There's no flippy cup game Friday and Saturday night,
Well, that's
and you're
where
going to freeze your ass off in the winter.
some education
So
comes into it, and allowing people to have a voice that push back and
yeah.
talk. I mean, I think it is really
Well, I
important.
mean, part of it is like, we've entered this time in society where it's like, we want to make everybody happy, and like, sorry, in a capitalist society, that just doesn't happen. It sucks. It's unfortunate, but the great thing about capitalism is you have winners and losers, and hopefully the losers learn from their mistakes and they eventually become winners. Like, that is essentially the rotation, if you will. And as it relates to energy, we've gotten so caught up in making people feel good, like we're doing it to their detriment, right? We're doing it to the detriment of their long-term prosperity. It's got to suck being a student coming out of college right now. Can you imagine coming out of college or being new in the job force, and your mortgage rate is 7.5%, and the interest rate on your credit card is 31%, and auto loan is 12%, and no disrespect to any Hyundai owners out there, but a Hyundai Sonata is like 60 grand. Like, what the hell, man? Like, but those have all implications from just bad policy. And I think energy is in part to blame, right? If we're being honest with ourselves, because they've just let it happen. They're like, we do our thing, we do what we do, you need us, we don't have to necessarily participate. And that that backfired. And now we're playing catch up. The energy space is playing catch up. And I feel, back to access to capital, it probably takes a technology company 3 or 4 meetings to get an investment. It's going to take an energy company 8 or 9 meetings. It's going to take longer. There's more work involved. It's more of a grind. It can be done, but we have to stop playing this stupid game where it's like, they're wrong, I'm right. They're wrong, I'm not doing the data, I'm not doing the submission, and I'm not imitating anyone. But it's like, no, get the data, figure out where you're vulnerable preemptively, fix it, and then once you do, go to the street and brag about it. Like, just don't keep quiet. Like, I don't understand that philosophy. Shove it
So
in their face.
I think we can agree that, I mean, I think data and knowledge is power, and so you got to play the game to be in the game. And I do get that point. We went from ESG to capitalism, and that's a whole nother podcast. But we're at the
Yeah.
post 1 hour mark, so we do need to close.
Yep.
But I think that it's been an absolute pleasure. I think you're
Yeah. Thank you.
we can continue to debate and talk, and I think these are all really important. But you're right about the industry. We just take it from a little bit different vantage point. I think I'm third generation oil and gas.
Mhm.
and and a huge advocate of the industry, largely for I'll call it the industry left, right, and center when they make
Yeah.
mistakes, but the industry has, and to me is making a huge mistake now by the way they have leaned into net zero 2050, the way they have leaned into
Yeah.
the energy transition, and the inability for them to articulate the positives about the oil and gas industry. We actually have the moral high ground now, and it's not being taken. And so, in that battle of winning hearts and minds, and providing people low cost energy, the industry
Yeah.
just isn't even one. They were bad. The industry has always been duck and cover. And so, to your point
Yeah.
about like the students, I completely agree. And I got to say that when I'm out there talking and having when I'm meeting with CEOs and when I'm talking with folks all the time, the one thing I always hear from people is, wow, you push back on everything and you're not afraid to. And I think I am not willing to hurt. Like, I'm sorry if your feelings get
Yeah.
hurt. It's feelings. Like,
Yeah.
I'm still going to be friends with you. I don't mind if you disagree with me, but I think we need to get a lot more comfortable about being uncomfortable. And
Well,
we
I think to a certain extent, yes. And by the way, I'm not at all shocked that you push back on stuff. Wow, shocker of the hour, lovingly. I I I disagree a little bit. I definitely agreed to the point of like making things uncomfortable in the sense of like debating it, but I also think there has to be a concerted effort to just stop pandering to your respective echo chamber, and
oh
both
I, d-
sides are guilty of it,
I
right?
agree with
The
that, and
echo
I think
chamber pandering is driving me nuts. It's like, here's the
you can't move the
data, here's
needle.
how it's trending,
Right.
end of story, take it or leave it. You can't argue with it. If you don't like it, you know tough. The numbers are the numbers, the math is the math, the trend is the trend,
Right.
end of story.
So we have to do people like you and I and the industry have to do a better job of figuring out how we actually move the needle. And I don't think we've
Yeah.
done that. So I think that's a good point to close on because we're after the hour
Yes.
mark. You've done a great job of pushing back and interrupting me. So I appreciate it. It has been an absolute blast. And I'll totally have you back on very soon. So thank you so much
Yeah,
again.
this is
Appreciate
awesome.
it.
And in fairness, you told me to push back and interrupt, so I
Yeah,
took you up on that offer. But
absolutely.
I do appreciate the conversation. I could talk about this stuff all day, but thanks for having me on. This is awesome.
Absolutely. Bye guys.